Hi, I'm James from Chaosium. I sat down with Jeff Richard, who is the creative director of Chaosium, and we talked about long-running RuneQuest campaigns. There's a lot of people out there who have been playing the same campaign for 5, 10, 15, even 20 years, and Jeff wanted to make a video that speaks directly to them. It talks about the unique insight that playing a game for that long gives you, and the unique perspective that you develop when you're looking at a system with a multi-year game in mind rather than just something that you're going to play out in a couple of months. I'll jump across to that interview in just a moment, but first, please remember to subscribe. Thanks for watching.
Well, I've heard of people running RuneQuest campaigns that have started back in the late 70s or early 80s and have just gone on some regular basis for almost 40 years. But the longest I've ever had any personal involvement with was a game that we did back in the 1990s that I think ran from about 1994 till about 2000, I think. So we're talking 5 or 6 years, I believe.
When I think about a long-running campaign, often it's just going through a single book, something that takes a year or two is very, very long. Does role-playing take on a different kind of style or dynamic when you've got these mega long games that are happening over massive periods, like 6 years or more?
Oh, absolutely. I think I greatly prefer longish campaigns. The downsides, and let's start with them. The downsides are it is very hard to keep a group of 4 or 5 people together to be able to meet on any sort of a routine basis for years on end. And that is that the logistics of a long campaign are not to be underestimated. But what you develop in terms of story arcs and multiple story arcs that weave up and weave down, and characters change, not just characters don't just change in terms of their skills or their magic or whatnot, but they change as characters. Their personalities might change. Their relationships, their passions can change over the course of that much time. And we've done those long games, and really, if I think about it, the longest games that I've had, we had a campaign called the Taming of Dragon Pass. That was the longest one. And that was a hybrid of Pendragon and RuneQuest. Very much a proto version of the modern RuneQuest Glorantha. And that went over about 25 years of game time, from the characters arriving in the unsettled wilderness that was Taming of Dragon Pass, clearing out an area, building up, over basically 3 generations of play, starting as young folk, becoming, important movers of shakers in their community, and then finally dying gloriously as all of the people they've pissed off over 20 years united and took them down. In this great Wagnerian final battle, which ended up with pretty much total party kill, but glorious total party kill. And that's the sort of thing you can get in these long games, because people develop, relationships both both positive and negative, and these things build up and build up, and God, I love them.
Of all the different stories I've heard about people running really, really long campaigns, a disproportionate number of them seem to be RuneQuest or, BRP related, at least. Do you think there's a reason for that?
Yeah, I think that the mechanics encourage that sort of progression. So one of the things in most BRP games is that at a certain point, the changes to your character aren't based on their new abilities or on their increased power or whatnot, but they tend to be at a certain point, I'm the most skilled killer in this community. My killing ability isn't going to really increase dramatically, but that's not the point. I'm going to be going, my story arc may be a long, lengthy, generation-long quest of vengeance, something like Lone Wolf and Cub, right? Which I consider to be a great model for that. Or it lends itself very much to saga style play, where the characters become something important, and the storyline doesn't cap out because they're no longer too tough for anything to fight. In BRP, your character is always, no matter how powerful they are, potentially fragile. And that means that a game that goes beyond the simple accumulation of power and abilities and the saving of the world, a campaign can continue to be really exciting when it's just about your character dealing with the consequences of their adventures, and then the consequences of the consequences.
So what advice do you have for people who are in these long-running games?
Well, first off, get very used to going outside of material that has been written for you by other people, because you will. So other than the Grand Pendragon campaign itself for King Arthur Pendragon, there are really very few published generational campaigns for any game or any system. And if you're playing a really long-term campaign, your setting should change. And by that I mean that if your setting remains exactly the same it was in year 0 as in year 20, then your characters are no longer interacting with it. The setting has become nothing but cardboard background. And so that puts a lot of responsibility on the GM, that you've got to be willing to change elements of the setting to reflect one. Obviously it needs to reflect your character's actions. If your characters have become the rulers of Apple Lane, then everything needs to reflect the fact that they're now the rulers of Apple Lane. But also the setting itself should change based on actions that the players have no control over, because we can't believe a world where we are responsible for everything that happens. That's a terrible burden. So as a GM, this is really what you need to be putting your thought into, is as the players move through time, what does that do to the setting? How do we change that? How do we create this feeling of dynamism?
Here's a kind of practical question. What do you think about updating systems when you're moving through an already established story? And this could be changing from one system to the other, more like what you did with Pendragon and RuneQuest, or this could be going from, say, one edition of RuneQuest to a new edition of RuneQuest.
I don't find that works very well. I don't want to throw cold water on anybody on this, but I find that different game systems, and I'm not talking about the difference between moving between RQ3 and RQG, or between RQ2 and RQG, or between first edition Call of Cthulhu and 7th edition Call of Cthulhu. That you could do pretty easily. That's basically, hey, here's some new house rules, because the basic conceits of the setting and the mechanics are the same. But moving from, say, Hero Quest to RuneQuest with the same characters in the same setting gets really tough, because your characters are just different. Every rule system models something different about your characters, and it's really hard to translate that. And in fact, I don't think you can really call that translation so much as transliteration. And at that point, it's a new story. Again, not throwing cold water on anybody on that. If you can do it, do it. But my experiences with it have usually meant when I change the core rule system beyond just a newer edition of it, we end up in a few sessions having a new game anyways.
At the end of a lot of these interviews, I like to get you to give a piece of kind of practical advice to people who find themselves in a situation that we're discussing. This would usually be like, all right, so what do you want to say to all the people who are in long running games and things like that? But I think that if somebody's been playing RuneQuest for nigh on 40 years, they're probably pretty confident about the position that they're in. So while they're going to get the advice,
I can give some advice that I think if you're going to be doing a long running game, first and foremost, make sure that there is some kind of a log. Absolutely essential. Have somebody write down what happened every session. And the reason being is that at a certain point, you're not going to remember what's going on and how the storylines developed. And you need to be able to do, you're at a certain point, you're going to want to revisit early parts of the campaign to be able to pull things that happened then and bring them forward and bring that back into the story, but if it's all, maybe you are an amazing GM or an amazing player that has the ability of remembering everything that happened in every session, even if a month or two went between individual sessions. But I'm not that person. So have somebody who writes it down, and ideally have somebody who writes it down, not like a fan fiction tale with all sorts of grandiose dialogue, but like an Icelandic saga. The year is in the year 1625 Earth season. Hovild the Grim went with his friends over the Rockwood Mountains. They were attacked by trolls but took 3 of them hostage. That very terse style, because what that ends up doing is it as a GM, it gives you just enough that you're then a year or 2 years later or 5 years later are able to pull characters that the characters ran across the path of 5 years ago, and now you're dealing with them, and they, this character really hates you all because maybe from your point of view you didn't give Grognard the Gross a moment of thought after you killed his friends and stole his bison, but Grognard spent the last 5 years learning to kill things with his left hand. And it's like that scene in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, where there's at the very opening of the movie, Tuco kills a whole bunch of folk, and one of the guys is shot in the arm and he's not dead, but he tries to fire at Tuco and misses, and Tuco goes off and does his adventures. And then 3/4 through the movie, this guy returns, having seen that Tuco is in town. He's spent the last 6 months learning to shoot with his left hand. He's got Tuco exactly where he wants, in the bathtub. He has his gun, and he starts monologuing. Tuco, gives his immortal line, shoots him dead, and says, when you got to shoot, don't talk. But because that linked you back to the beginning of the movie, that's just such a wonderful scene.
For people who might be 17, 18, 19, they're starting off.
Oh, that's the best time to start running a long-term campaign.
So what advice can you give those people? What's something that they can do now that is going to save them a ton of time when they're in their 50s and mean that their campaign is going to be spectacular the whole way?
Oh, well, gosh, if you want to run till 17 we're now in a world where you can theoretically do that. What I would do, if I was building that up, is make sure that we have built up characters that are interesting because of their personality and their psychology, not because of their cult, their occupation, or their stats. And the reason being is, if you're going to be playing on a long campaign with that character, at a certain point, the cult isn't going to be what keeps you going. Your occupation and your skills aren't what's going to keep you going. It's going to be that character's personality and psychology, because you want to revisit them and revisit how they do things. Think about it like a long-running movie franchise. Nobody wants to watch Harrison Ford do Indiana Jones 5 to be able to show that Indiana Jones knows how to fight, shoot a gun, and is an archaeologist. Because we know this, it's established. We want to revisit that character because we want to see how the cocky, smug, almost trickster character, that first movie, how that character has aged and what they've become 50 years later, because that the character's personality and psychology is fun and interesting, and we want to see how that's changed. But if it's a character that really only matters because, well, this is the character that comes in and they're super functional at doing super functional things, but their personality is kind of non-existent. Whatever, it's going to be, it's like watching a modern Terminator movie when the robots are the most interesting thing in it. You want to start with characters that their psychology is interesting and that have something that you want to play with. And then after that, go through and have your game be about your character's interaction with the other players and your character's interaction with their community and the greater world. And it'll save you a whole lot of time and probably a whole lot of iterations of your character a lot further down the road.